Hello, welcome back to another episode of Decoding with WINFO. My name is Chloe Mao. I am thrilled to be your host for this episode of Decoding with WINFO. That is already enough about me. I'd love to introduce the fantastic guest we have here today, Professor Ryan Calo. Now, Professor Calo, you are a founding co-director of the UW Tech Policy Lab, and you are a co-founder of the UW Center for an Informed Public. Now, those are two very prominent initiatives right here at UW. Not only that, but you have joint appointments at the UW I School as well as the Allen School, and that is a severe understatement of the breadth of work you do and have done. So, I'd love for you to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a bit about the work that you do.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. So mostly what I do is I think about how the law should approach technology, especially emerging technology. Over the years, I've looked at a very wide range of technologies, from driverless cars to drones to augmented and virtual reality. Most recently, of course, like many people, I've been focusing on artificial intelligence, but not exclusively. Just recently, I published a book with Oxford University Press that is called Law and Technology: A Methodical Approach. And the book really canvasses my last couple decades thinking about law and technology, and I've been traveling all over the world, giving talks on that book.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. I mean, we'd love to plug that book as well with our audience. But before we really get into the nitty-gritty, I want to first ask you, about your story, the journey, the personal realizations.
Sure.
How did you find your way into law and technology?
It's like with anything, you can sort of tell a story in retrospect, right? I kind of always suspected that I would be an academic. My mother was an art history professor at Colgate University, and my father worked at Syracuse University. Actually, for that reason, I grew up partly in Florence, Italy. But I just have spent my whole life on campuses, and so I kind of can't imagine working anywhere else. But after I graduated from college, where I was a philosophy major and an English creative writing minor, I actually moved to New York City and investigated allegations of police misconduct for 3 years. Eventually went to law school, but it was really in law school where my passion for thinking about emerging technologies came about. I actually planned a conference about media concentration, so the idea that one company would own multiple forms of media within a particular jurisdiction, a particular geographic location, and some of the sort of concerns that would arise where the same individual, family, company would own the newspaper and would own the TV and would own now looking back over the years as a law and technology professor, I've drawn from all of those parts of my life, right? I mean, so for example, I testified before the United States Senate about 4 times. Once about law enforcement use of drones. And of course, I knew a lot about law enforcement, having investigated the NYPD. I founded, as you mentioned, Chloe, at the outset, the Center for an Informed Public with my colleagues. That center looks at mis and disinformation. And the idea that there would be one source of information that would pose as multiple sources and cause a kind of echo chamber around an idea that was political in nature or even potentially false is of enormous importance, right? That's just how life is. You draw from your experience, you tell a story retroactively, but there was no way. It wasn't like I was 9 years old and people asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up. And I was like, I want to be a law and technology professor. Like that's not at all true.
And you touched on a lot of points about the different work you've done. You've testified in front of Senate, you've spoken at different conferences, organized different events, and I kind of just want to break that apart just a bit. But first, for the students who are part of Info, as well as other related departments, in your words, for those students who might not have a clear picture of what tech policy is and really what it looks like in practice, how would you define that?
So I teach a course, some of you are aware of it, on technology policy and ethics. And in that, for undergrads, I'm teaching it again in the spring. And I end up having to define all those terms, right? But let's work on, so first of all, with technology has been something that people have tried to define so many times. And if you look at the sort of early philosophy of technology, the idea was that technology was just basically science applied. It was any time you took knowledge and applied it in the world to have an impact. And so people like Jacques Ellul, Lewis Mumford, and others, they really didn't even distinguish between technology and technique. So the way you would do something, right? Maybe the way that you would lay out a factory floor, or the way you would organize a club like this one, right? These things were conterminous with technology. Whereas my focus is very much on artifacts and systems. I'm interested in artifacts and systems that people made in order to extend human affordances and capabilities. And I'm interested in these things even if they don't work as advertised, even if we don't know how they work. For example, I'm fascinated by this mystical object that Mormons, that's a part of Mormon history, that's called the Liahona, which is also the name of the Mormon Church of Latter-day Saints major newsletter, for those of you who may not be familiar. And the Liahona was a kind of GPS device that helped the Mormons navigate through a forest, and it was powered by faith. And I find it to be a fascinating technology to study. Did it really work? Right? Was it just merely that people believed that it worked? It doesn't matter. What matters is that this is an object or a system that people created in order to extend their capabilities, right? And so that's what I think about when I think about technology. And that includes, of course, all manner of contemporary information systems, like large language models or social media or whatever it happens to be. Law and policy, too, is obviously quite a expansive area, right? I think what's really important to understand about law and policy is these are rules that govern our behavior, but they're not any kind of rule at all. They're rules set by an authority that we have recognized as being entitled to set the rules and to police the rules and actually to punish people, even using violence if they break the rules. This Max Weber referred to the state as having a monopoly on the lawful use of violence, right? So these are not rules like the rules of a game that you play with your friends, or the rules of the road, or the rules of thumb, or the rules of etiquette. Law and policy refers to official rules that are passed in, for example, a democratic system like ours, by the right kinds of entities using the right kinds of policies and procedures. But ultimately, there's no other way really to distinguish them. Policies tend to be more strategic and directive. So we have a policy of promoting innovation, whereas laws tend to be the specific way in which we instantiate that policy. In the United States, so much of the rules that govern our lives are actually not directly from Congress, but rather from these creatures called agencies that Congress creates. So the Congress creates the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Communications Commission. These are these sort of, to stick with a religious metaphor, these golem that Congress creates through an act of legislative creation. They then have the expertise and the time and the personnel to promulgate the regulations that in turn affect us all, right? So much of, if you ever decide to go to law school, we have begun to require administrative law, in part because so many of the rules that actually affect people's lives come from these agencies.
Right, and I mean, these agencies are like executive. They execute, the specific orderings or the legislation that have already been enacted, and they carry that out. But sometimes in violent ways, even.
It depends on who's in charge of them, right? So
right.
A thing to understand about U.S. agencies, including, for example, ICE, or Department of Homeland Security, or the Federal Trade Commission, or the Federal Communications Commission, or the Department of Justice, they don't appear in the Constitution, right? They were all created through acts of Congress. However, they take their direction from the executive. Why is that? Because the Constitution does give the executive the ability to appoint the heads of these agencies and to replace those heads of those agencies if the president is dissatisfied with their performance. So you've heard a lot these days about executive orders, right? These are things coming down like edicts from the White House. And you might wonder to yourself, what legal import do they really have? And they don't really have any true legal significance unless the president has already been empowered by Congress the president can, if the president's allowed by Congress to set tariffs, then those tariffs can be set through executive order. But the president has no independent power that's not been conferred to him by the Constitution or by Congress. Nevertheless, agencies will scramble to respond to executive orders because their leadership fears being replaced. You know what I mean?
We saw that today.
We sure did. Yeah, we absolutely sure did. That's a great example.
Well, I mean, with such, two different fields, we've got a lot of, whatever's happening in federal government. We've had things that are at the local level, more regional. So with law, policy, mandates, things like that, as well as, emerging technology and what we've seen in our AI bubble, as some people call it. How would you think that, these two fields, they are connected. How do you think that bridging them together helps better human progression?
Well, I guess I would answer that in a slightly orthogonal way, okay? So the way I think about it is that technology is an enormously important social fact, right? The state of technology and technology itself and the people that create technology has a lot of power in shaping society. There are relatively few forces within society that are capable of meaningfully pushing back against the impacts of technology. One of them is law. But it turns out that technology has certain characteristics that make it really difficult for the law to analyze and intervene. One of which is, for example, that technology tends to make a kind of shell game of human responsibility. Now, do you know what I mean by a shell game? It's like where you see there's like 3 cups and there's like a ball and someone like moves them around and you have to guess which one it is, right? And then there's like some person you don't know is their friend who's guessing wrong and you're like, oh shit, I could guess better than that. I guess I can use swear words in this podcast.
We can keep them limited,
okay.
But it's not. I think it's relatively conversational.
I apologize for that.
Not.
So in any event, you say, shoot, I could probably I could guess better than that, and suddenly you're out $20, right? So when I say that you make a shell game of responsibility, what I'm saying is that oftentimes when we do things with or through technology, there are decisions there. There are preconceptions, goals, worldviews, and so on that are present when a harm occurs or when an action occurs, but it doesn't feel like they are. For example, a woman died when she was struck by an Uber driverless car in Arizona a couple of years ago. And Uber had hired a woman to sit behind the wheel all day and monitor this car that drives itself. And unfortunately, that woman was not paying attention at a critical moment when the victim crossed against a crosswalk, like against a light, stepped into the street, and she wasn't monitoring the car at that very moment, and the car struck and killed this woman. And the driver that Uber hired was charged criminally by Arizona for criminal negligent homicide because she didn't pay attention, and due to not paying attention, she struck the other person. But at the same time, the Department of Transportation, one of these agencies we were just talking about, did an investigation of Uber's safety culture and found it very lacking. One of the decisions that Uber made was that they built their technology on top of a contemporary Volvo. And that Volvo had standard collision detection. This car had the ability to see it was about to hit something and hit the brakes on its own. Uber turned that off. And the reason that they turned it off is because they wanted to test their own technology. And they didn't want to have that noise of Volvo's technology on top of their own. That decision to turn off Volvo's auto detection also was a but-for cause of this woman, Elaine Hirschberg's, death. Okay? But nothing happened to Uber. Right? This woman, by the way, it's really tragic. There's interior footage from the Uber that's looking at the driver. And this driver is paying attention, then goes and looks down at something for a moment and does that for a minute or so. And then at the last minute, out of the corner of her eye, she sees that someone's crossing the street. She jumps up, she tries to take control of the vehicle, and doesn't do it in time. It's a split-second decision, a long day of being behind the wheel of something that's supposed to drive itself, right? Criminal charges. How did Uber's decision unfold to turn off Volvo's own safety feature? Probably over a series of emails, in a conference room, over phone calls. It was a very deliberative action. It wasn't in the moment, it wasn't an emergency. They thought about it. And yet that decision was ultimately really invisible to the authorities. This is a quality that technology has and has long had. And it's one of three, I think, primary characteristics of technology that make it hard for law to analyze. And so when I think of the field of law and technology of which I'm a participant, I think of us, that community, as the people that know how to analyze technology and not be misled by these characteristics. And so that's I think a central contribution of my field is we're the ones who get technology and know how to analyze it without being misled, and therefore find a pathway to then intervene and have some safeguards and controls around this enormously powerful social force.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned, a critical, I think, kind of phrase earlier about meaningfully pushing back about these huge conglomerates, these companies, these private companies who are really spearheading this new era of emerging technology, and obviously some of which are not facing proper ramifications for their actions. Yeah. And so with that, I kind of want to scope kind of our perspective here down to right here at UW. In terms of meaningfully pushing back, you started two initiatives, one of which is the Tech Policy Lab. So I kind of want to talk about that first, and can you just tell us about its mission, some of the work that it's doing right now?
Yeah. Well, the Tech Policy Lab formally bridges three units law, information science, and computer science. And we have co-equal directors from each of those units. But we also have faculty and students from many other departments as well. And the way that we operate is we put together interdisciplinary teams in order to gain traction on especially difficult or neglected areas of technology policy. One of the most recent projects we worked on was agricultural technology policy, and the way in which agricultural technology policy tends to reflect the priorities of gigantic companies and huge conglomerates of farmers, as opposed to individual, more local, rural farmers. Farmers who are working as part of a giant business have very different technological needs than smaller, more locally sourced farms and so on. And so we wrote a white paper suggesting that technology policy in the Farm Act and other sources better match the needs of smaller, more local civic farmers, right? And in doing that, we brought together people who were experts in farming and people who were experts in law and policy and people and so on, right? We've had a variety of projects, some about augmented reality, driverless cars. A really particularly interesting project to me was we created a book of short stories about the ways in which AI that's developed in a particular context ends up not being culturally responsive when it's deployed in other contexts, such as the continent of Africa or South America, whatever. So we invited people from all over the world, every populated continent, and we did a short story workshop in which we invited people to write short stories about the ways in which AI was not culturally responsive. And it resulted in this beautiful book that we have published. So, we do projects like that, right? We're really interested in doing things that require many disciplines to be integrated and blended, many kinds of knowledge. And we also try to foreground issues that we don't think are necessarily today a part of mainstream policy, and should be.
I mean, it sounds like, this lab is a perfect representation of what interdisciplinary work is and how that can really push forward in surface items that are not usually seen in maybe other traditional academic pathways, for sure. For the second initiative here at UW as well, I want to talk about the Center for Informed Public, CIP. For this center, what sort of gap was it designed to fill upon its founding?
Yeah. So the Center for an Informed Public is a much larger organization than the Tech Policy Lab. First of all, it has 5 founders, 3 of whom are from the School of Information. One of them is me from the law school, and another is Kate Starbird, a very famous professor in the human-centered design and engineering. And our mandate is to think about basically mis and disinformation and how it originates and where it flows and what impacts it has and so on. And we were founded at a time when there was an enormous and very consequential uptick of mis and disinformation, particularly out of the Trump administration or Trump as a candidate, right? And so we do a very wide range of projects, from like a mis and disinformation escape room. Yeah, like an escape room. It's funny, my daughter Ramona, she just turned 12, and this weekend we're doing an escape room for her birthday party with I'm taking 9 little girls to the escape room again.
Chaperoning.
Chaperoning. And man, they love escape rooms so much. But anyway, we created a series of escape rooms where you have to navigate BS and misinformation in order to solve the escape room. And so it sharpens your skills at being more discerning about the sources of media. We also do a MisInfo Day where we train high school students and teachers, hundreds of them, to be more discerning about media that they encounter. Lots and lots of research tracing information flows and the like. And so, and by the way, both the Tech Policy Lab and the Center for Informed Public, we also do a lot of like convening. For example, the center is having, you guys should really check this out actually. It's April, it's in early April, and it's Kashmir Hill from the New York Times and Jeff Horowitz from Reuters talking about their reporting into the harms of chatbots. And Monica Nicholsberg, who's from KUOW, is interviewing them. And I can send you the information about it. But we're having this big public event. We do a lot of stuff with Town Hall and KUOW and so on, because a part of our mandate is to not just do research about misinformation, but get our findings and conclusions and tools out there in order to improve the ecosystem.
Absolutely. And in terms of getting information out there, of course, I want to talk about your experience testifying in front of the Congress, in front of the U.S. Senate. You've done it 4 times, which is absolutely remarkable. I mean, I was able to watch kind of one of your speeches and your testimony for one of those as well. And I wanted to touch on some of those points. But first, what was that experience like for you?
Well, so, as a professor, you get to be very, very arguably too comfortable speaking in front of people. You know what I mean? But every once in a while, you're called upon to speak in a forum that you've never done before. And it becomes nerve-wracking all over again. Like the first time you had to do a presentation as a student. And the first time I testified before the U.S. Senate was before Senate Judiciary about law enforcement use of drones. And I was very, very nervous. And I prepared so much and wrote this lengthy testimony and everything else. And they were like, Professor Calo, you have 5 minutes. You know what I mean? And so then I really had to think about, what do I want to get across to this group of people in 5 minutes? Now, of course, they're going to ask me follow-up questions, and they did. But gosh, I can't even to this day remember the experience. I was so nervous. And I was practically reading from my carefully timed 5-minute statement. Second time I did it, it was about augmented and virtual reality. That I remember very well, because having done it one time before, I knew the drill, and I knew that I needed to come forward and have a plan to use my time wisely to get across and reinforce a couple of points that I thought the senators needed to know and wouldn't come from anyone else on that panel. Third time, it was about contact tracing apps during COVID and how technology was being used to combat COVID. That was a virtual hearing,
Right.
by necessity. The most recent time was last year. It was about AI and privacy. I wasn't nervous at all. You know what I mean? I think I wrote the testimony the day before. And so it's just like, it's just a very, very different experience once you do it a bunch of times, right?
Yeah.
And also, like, AI and privacy is just what I do all the time. And so I felt very, very, very comfortable. But it's been a great honor to be able to participate in this way. I think you almost have more impact when a couple of high-level staffers call you up and say, we're thinking about writing a bill about this particular issue, and you get a chance to help shape that bill. I think that's almost more influential sometimes. And the testimony is often like kind of performative. They're trying to kind of make points and score points against the other side and things like that. So it's but no, it's been a great honor, and it surprises me to think about the fact that I've done it so many times. Yeah.
And before we delve into Q&A, and that was really just scoping down, your experience in testifying and just kind of your opinion on just everything. I want to just kind of talk to the audience here, as well as the info students who, might be listening into this podcast. So, a lot of students are, and I would say even me especially, we're wrestling and understanding where to toe the line when it comes to ethical AI use. In your opinion, what's your advice to young people trying to just figure out what is that line?
Oh gosh.
That is a good question.
Yeah, really my inclination is just to tell you that you're doing yourself a disservice if you're completely ignoring AI as a phenomenon, right? I mean, you're going to go into a work, and not just work, but also play and romance and other kinds of environment that is that AI affects. So I would say familiarize yourself with these tools and think about how you can use them to be more productive and creative.
Yeah.
That said, you also do yourself a deep disservice by outsourcing your learning and thinking to these tools, because you're paying money and you're spending time at a university in order to learn things that are going to carry through to your whole life and your whole career. And that's a very privileged and wonderful thing. And if all of your papers and all of your answers are coming from ChatGPT or a cloud, you're really doing yourself a deep disservice. So I recognize there's a tension there. Here I am telling you that you should use these tools, you should familiarize yourself with them, that employers will expect you to not just know how to use them. Like, it used to be that like employers would be like, oh, well, we want to make sure that when you join our company, you already know how to use Word, right? No, they're going to be looking to you to be especially savvy, to teach them what the power of these things are, to behave differently from their older employees because you grew up around these tools. But if you'll never learn some very, very important skills around expression and problem solving and so on if you outsource everything to these technologies. Now, you ask questions about ethics. That's such a thick and complicated question. Like the environmental impact of AI, the way that it's biased in certain ways. I think it's worth reflecting on the limitations, including moral limitations of these technologies. It's worth reflecting on who's creating them and what are their goals, and how are those goals problematic. It's worth thinking about some of the very strange, borderline eugenic applications of technology that purport to tell you that you can tell if somebody is a criminal by analyzing their face. You know what I mean? Like these are things that some very old and bad ideas are resurfacing in AI research, and you need to be mindful what you work on. Right? You do not want to find yourself inadvertently working on something that later on you discover or come to realize is deeply problematic, right? But we can't possibly trace through all the ethical issues that these things raise here.
Yeah, again, the term is black box, right? We don't know a lot of the things that are going on, especially the technical behind the scenes work, and really what is the goal, right? We're not sure what that exactly is yet, but I think obviously, your words of wisdom are very much impactful for, people who grew up now with this technology compared to older generations. So thank you for your words of wisdom. We really do appreciate that. I think at this point, we're going to be opening it up for a quick Q&A if anyone has questions.